The year was 1803. The air in New Orleans was heavy, with the scent of salt water, horse sweat, and ambition. Thomas McAllister, a broad-shouldered man of 34 with a weathered face and eyes the color of the Mississippi mud, stepped off a creaking riverboat onto the bustling docks of the Crescent City. Behind him lay Scotland, the land of his birth, with its cold moors and hard winters. Ahead lay a continent so vast and wild that no map could capture its full measure. In the taverns and markets, talk buzzed of President Jefferson's deal with Napoleon, the Louisiana Purchase, a transaction so vast it had doubled the size of the young United States overnight. Land, they said, for pennies an acre, land enough for a man to vanish from his past, to start over with nothing but his hands and his will. Thomas had both an abundance, and he carried in his pocket the last of his savings, sewn into the lining of his coat. 60 silver dollars and a worn brass compass given to him by his father. The docks swarmed with Creole merchants shouting in French, Spanish traders hawking barrels of rum, and boatmen unloading crates of sugar and coffee from the Caribbean. Slaves in chains shuffled past, heads bowed, driven by overseers barking orders in rough English. The city was a collision of worlds. Catholic bells rang from St. Louis Cathedral while river gamblers laughed under the shade of cottonwood trees. Thomas breathed it in and knew, in his bones, he had come to the right place. His first weeks were spent in the employ of a French merchant named Duval, a man whose powdered wig and fine waistcoat could not conceal the ruthlessness in his eyes. Thomas worked the docks by day and the warehouse by night, hauling sacks of grain and rolling barrels until his back screamed. But with each passing week, he learned more about the trade routes, the river currents, the prices of fur, the value of cotton, and most importantly, the rumors of rich, untouched farmland upriver. Land that now belonged to the United States, though the native tribes who had lived there for centuries might think otherwise. Duval warned him not to wander too far into the interior. "The wilderness swallows men whole," he said, sipping his brandy, "and if the land does not kill you, the people there will." Thomas smiled but said nothing. Men like Duval thought in terms of profit. Thomas thought in terms of destiny. The spring of 1804, Thomas signed his name, in his careful, unpracticed hand, to a deed for 200 acres along a bend in the Mississippi, north of Baton Rouge. The land was cheap because it was dangerous. Floods, fevers, and the occasional raid by hostile tribes had driven off the last settlers. He bought a mule, a rusted plow, and a second-hand flintlock musket, and set off upriver in a flat-bottomed skiff. The journey was grueling, the nights thick with the hum of mosquitoes, the air heavy with the scent of cypress and decay. He slept with the musket across his knees, knowing that both man and beast prowled the darkness. By summer's end, he had raised a crude log cabin and cleared enough ground for corn and beans. The soil was black and rich, the river a lifeline of fish and waterfowl. Still loneliness pressed on him like a weight. The nearest neighbor was a half-day's walk away, an old Spanish trapper who spoke little English but could drink whiskey like a man possessed. It was on a humid evening in 1805, while trading for salt and flour in Baton Rouge, that Thomas met Eliza Carter. She was the daughter of a Virginian trader, tall and willowy, with hair the color of chestnuts and a gaze that could still a man's breath. She was no stranger to the roughness of frontier life, and when Thomas spoke of his land, she did not flinch at the dangers. They married that autumn under the open sky. The ceremony performed by a traveling preacher whose Bible was as battered as his boots. Life was hard, but good. Eliza tended the garden and milked the goats, while Thomas expanded the fields. By 1810 they had 2 children, Samuel, strong and stubborn like his father, and Mary, bright-eyed and curious like her mother. The Mississippi was their highway to the world. Once a month, Thomas would load the skiff with corn, smoked meat, and tanned hides, and float down to Baton Rouge to trade. He became known among the traders as a man who kept his word, a quality rarer than gold. But the frontier was never still. News traveled slow, carried on the river or in the mouths of itinerant peddlers. In 1812, war erupted between the United States and Britain. The Mississippi Valley became a contested land, with British agents stirring up tribes against the Americans. In New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson was gathering men to defend the city. Thomas, though no soldier by trade, felt the pull of duty. He kissed Eliza goodbye, leaving Samuel to watch over her, and rode south with a company of militia. The Battle of New Orleans in January 1815 was unlike anything Thomas had known. The British came in columns, redcoats flashing in the morning light, their muskets firing in disciplined volleys. Jackson's men, a ragged mix of frontiersmen, free black militiamen, Choctaw warriors, and even pirates, fought from behind earthen ramparts, their cannon tearing bloody gaps in the British lines. Thomas loaded and fired until his shoulder burned, the air thick with smoke and the smell of powder. When the battle was done, the field was littered with the dead, and the British, beaten, retreated to their ships. Thomas returned home a changed man. He had seen death up close, felt its breath on his neck, and survived. But the war had taken more than it had given. The Spanish trapper, his old neighbor, had been killed in a raid while Thomas was away. The cabin's roof leaked from a storm that had blown through. Samuel had grown taller, harder in his absence, and Mary clung to him as if afraid he might vanish again. Yet there was a new sense of belonging, too. The land was no longer just soil and timber. It was part of a nation that had fought to keep it. As he stood on the bluff overlooking the Mississippi, watching the muddy waters roll toward the sea, Thomas McAllister knew the river carried more than trade and travelers. It carried stories, dreams, and the restless spirit of a country still being born. And somewhere, far beyond the bend, lay the future, untamed, uncertain, and waiting for those bold enough to claim it. By the year 1820, Mississippi no longer felt as wild as it had when Thomas McAllister first staked his claim. The war had brought new settlers, and the riverbanks that were once dense with cypress and cane now showed signs of cabins, barns, and fenced fields. Baton Rouge bustled with more steamboats than flatboats, their paddle wheels churning the muddy water as they carried passengers. Freight and news from as far as Pittsburgh and St. Louis, the McAllister homestead had grown into a thriving farm. Cornfields stretched toward the tree line, hogs rooted in the yard, and a new barn built by Thomas and Samuel together stood tall and sturdy. Samuel, now a young man of 20, had his father's broad shoulders and restless eyes. His younger sister Mary, 16, was quick-witted and fiercely independent, preferring to ride bareback through the woods rather than sit at the loom. Thomas was proud of them both, but he could feel something stirring in Samuel, an itch that the Mississippi soil could not scratch. Stories were spreading, stories carried downriver by fur trappers, drifters, and soldiers, of the far western territories, where the land was so rich that crops grew without plowing, where rivers ran clear and cold from mountains higher than any in the east. The Oregon country, they called it, though the United States and Britain still argued over who owned it. And beyond the mountains lay California, a place whispered about like a dream, with valleys of endless grass and gold rumored in its rivers. Samuel listened to every word, leaning in at the tavern to hear of the trails west from Missouri, the buffalo herds on the plains, the dangers of crossing the Rockies. Thomas, who had risked his own life for land and survival, recognized the fire in his son's eyes. But he also knew the price such dreams demanded. In the winter of 1823, a Cherokee trader named Running Fox began passing through Baton Rouge with pelts and carved goods. He was a tall man, proud and calm, with eyes that measured every person he met. One cold night, after trading at the dockside market, he came to the McAllister cabin. Over venison stew, he spoke of his journeys, from the Smoky Mountains to the Great Plains, from the Arkansas River to the foothills of distant mountains where snow never fully melted. Samuel was captivated, but it was Mary who asked the boldest questions. Running Fox answered them with a slow smile, though there was sadness in his voice when he spoke of how the land his people roamed was shrinking each year, fenced and claimed by others. Months later, Samuel announced his decision. He would travel west to Missouri to see the frontier for himself. Thomas argued. Eliza pleaded, but neither could turn him from his course. He left in the spring of 1824, with Running Fox as his guide and a promise to return in a year. The journey was harder than Samuel had imagined. They rode for weeks along rough trails, crossing rivers swollen with spring floods, skirting villages where settlers eyed them warily. In St. Louis, a city of brick warehouses and muddy streets, Samuel saw the true gateway to the West. Here, expeditions were outfitted, supplies bought, and guides hired for the treacherous journey beyond the Missouri River. But Samuel's year in the frontier changed him. He trapped beaver in the icy streams of the Platte River, hunted buffalo on the plains, and learned from running fox how to read the wind and sky. Saw men die from fever, from falls, from the knives of other men. He returned home leaner, harder, and more determined than ever to push west again. By the 1830s, the McAllister farm was prosperous enough that Samuel's absences did not ruin it. He began organizing trips to Missouri for traders and settlers, guiding them along the rivers and overland routes. On one such journey in 1834, he met Abigail Turner, the daughter of a Kentucky blacksmith traveling with her family to start a new life. She had a laugh that rang like church bells and a stubborn streak to match Samuel's own. They married in Independence, Missouri, and returned to the Mississippi to live for a time. Samuel's dreams of Oregon never dimmed. Meanwhile, Mary had grown into a striking young woman, admired in Baton Rouge for her beauty and sharp tongue. Suitors came calling, but she surprised everyone by turning down a wealthy merchant's son and instead marrying a quiet but kind-hearted schoolteacher named Daniel Harlan. They settled near the McAllister farm, their lives rooted in the rhythms of planting and harvest. Yet even for those who stayed, the frontier had a way of calling. In 1836, word reached Baton Rouge that wagon trains were setting out for the West in greater numbers. Texas had won its independence from Mexico, and tales of rich farmland in Oregon grew more enticing with each retelling. Samuel, now with a young son of his own, began to speak openly of leading a wagon train all the way to the Pacific. Thomas, his hair now gray, but his back still straight, stood on the porch one summer night and looked out over the fields he had carved from wilderness. He remembered the day he had arrived in New Orleans, the weight of the unknown before him. And he understood at last that Samuel's hunger for the horizon was the same hunger that had driven him decades before. "The land will shape you," Thomas told his son. "It will break you and make you again, and if you're lucky, it'll let you call it your own. Remember, no matter how far you go, you're still a McAllister. And that means you finish what you start." Samuel nodded, his mind already far beyond the river's bend, where the sun sank into lands unclaimed, untamed, and waiting. By 1840, Samuel McAllister had made his choice. The Mississippi Valley, rich though it was, could no longer hold him. The rumors of fertile valleys and open land in the Oregon country had turned into letters from friends and fellow traders, who had gone ahead and sent back word of wheat growing higher than a man's waist, rivers thick with salmon, and timber enough to build 100 towns. The Treaty of 1818 had left Oregon jointly occupied by the United States and Britain. But the settlers pouring westward were tipping the balance in America's favor. The time to claim land was now, before it was carved up by others. Samuel's decision was not just about adventure. It was about securing a future for his wife Abigail and their son, Thomas Jr., who was now 6 years old. His father, the elder Thomas, was 71 and still tending his farm with Eliza. Mary and Daniel lived nearby with 3 children of their own. When Samuel announced his plan to lead a wagon train from Independence, Missouri, to the Oregon country, his family was split. Thomas understood the pull, but he also saw the danger. Eliza wept quietly, knowing what the wilderness could take from a man. Mary tried to talk him out of it, warning that the trail was a graveyard for the unprepared. But Abigail stood by her husband, her chin set with quiet resolve. "If there's a better life for our son out there, I'll go," she said. "I won't look back." In the spring of 1841, the McAllisters sold most of their livestock and loaded 2 sturdy wagons with everything they would need: flour, beans, bacon, salt, rifles, powder, blankets, tools, and seed for planting in Oregon. The wagons were covered with canvas stretched tight over wooden bows, each one pulled by a team of oxen. Samuel's party included 20 families: farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and a few single men with nothing to lose. They met in Independence, the last major outpost before the wilderness. Here the wagons formed a line that stretched across the prairie, white covers glowing in the sun like sails on a vast green ocean. The first weeks along the Platte River were almost idyllic. The land was flat, the grass high, and game plentiful. The children chased prairie dogs, and the women gathered wild berries. At night, the wagons formed a circle, campfires glowing as fiddles played and stories were told under the endless sky. But the Oregon Trail had a way of stripping away illusions. By the time they reached the foothills of the Rockies, the easy days were over. A sudden cholera outbreak struck the train, killing 3 in as many days. They buried them by the trail, marking the graves with rough wooden crosses. One family, overcome with grief, turned back east. Storms swept down from the mountains, drenching the wagons and turning the trail into a ribbon of mud. Oxen strained against the weight, their hooves sucking into the muck. Food supplies dwindled faster than planned, and hunting grew harder as game became scarce. It was during one of these desperate weeks that the betrayal came. James Wilkins, a smooth-talking trader who had joined the wagon train in Independence, vanished one night with a stolen rifle, 2 mules, and most of the party's powder and lead. Samuel was furious. He tracked Wilkins for 2 days before finding him in a small camp, drinking with 2 drifters. Words turned to blows. Samuel left him there with a broken nose and a warning that if he ever came within sight of the train again, he would be shot on sight. But the damage was done. The stolen supplies meant they would have to ration powder and be careful with every shot. Crossing the Rockies tested them to the breaking point. The wagons creaked and groaned over steep passes where the air was thin and cold. Abigail wrapped Thomas Jr. in furs at night, her face pale but determined. More than once, Samuel thought they might lose a wagon to the cliffs, but the teams held. On the far side of the mountains, the Snake River awaited. Wide, swift, and deadly. They built rafts and floated the wagons across, the oxen swimming beside them, snorting and kicking in the current. One wagon tipped, spilling tools and a barrel of flour into the river. The loss stung, but they moved on. When at last they reached the Columbia River in late summer, the sight of green valleys and towering evergreens brought tears to Abigail's eyes. But Oregon would not give itself easily. The British Hudson's Bay Company still held influence here, and the few American settlers were scattered in small, vulnerable communities. Samuel claimed a plot of land in the Willamette Valley where the soil was dark and the streams ran cold and clear. They built a rough cabin before the first frost, stacking the logs tight and sealing them with clay. By winter, they had cleared enough land to plant in the spring. That first Oregon winter was hard. Cold rain for weeks, storms that rattled the cabin walls, and food stretched thin. But the land promised much. When spring came, Samuel planted corn, wheat, and potatoes, and they grew as if the soil had been waiting for them. Word spread quickly that the McAllisters had survived and thrived. By 1846, more settlers were arriving each year, and Samuel was guiding wagon trains again, helping others make the dangerous journey he had conquered. Yet he never forgot the graves along the trail, the faces of those who had not made it. He knew that the price of the West was measured in lives as much as in land. By the winter of 1848, the Willamette Valley was alive with rumors. Samuel McAllister first heard it from a pair of ragged trappers, who came down from California, their mules loaded with pelts, and their eyes bright with excitement. They spoke of a carpenter named James Marshall, who had found gold in the tail race of a sawmill along the American River. Gold, they said, not just a few flakes, but nuggets big enough to weigh heavy in a man's palm. At first, Samuel laughed it off. He had seen enough gold strikes turn to dust, leaving men poorer than when they started. But the trappers insisted the news was real, swearing that every able-bodied man in San Francisco had abandoned his post to dig in the Sierra Nevada streams. Within weeks, more travelers confirmed it. Gold had been found, and it was there for the taking. Abigail saw the change in her husband's eyes before he spoke a word. Oregon had given them good land, but gold offered something else, a chance to secure a future so grand that their children would never know want. By spring, Samuel had gathered a small party of settlers. 6 men, including his younger cousin, Matthew, who had come west with a wagon train in '46, and a wiry, quick-tempered man named Eli Foster, whose skill with a pistol was matched only by his bad temper. They packed tools, flour, salt, pork, coffee, and enough powder and shot for hunting and defense. Abigail stayed behind with Thomas Jr., now a sturdy 13-year-old who was already learning the plow and rifle. The journey south was grueling. They crossed the Rogue Valley and the Klamath Mountains, where late snow turned passes into icy traps. Along the Sacramento Valley, they saw the first signs of the gold fever madness. Abandoned farms, towns where only women and children remained. Men selling everything. Tools, horses, even the shirts off their backs. For a chance at the diggings. When the McAllister party reached the American River, they found chaos. The riverbanks were lined with tents, shanties, and lean-tos. The air filled with the sound of hammers, shovels, and the constant murmur of men dreaming aloud of fortunes to come. There were Americans, Mexicans, Chileans, Chinese, and a dozen other nationalities, all digging in the same cold, fast-moving water. At first, the gold seemed easy enough to find. Samuel and Matthew worked side by side, their pans catching flakes and small nuggets that glittered in the sun. Eli, impatient for bigger finds, took to scouting upstream, returning with wild tales of pockets that would make them rich overnight. But the longer they stayed, the more Samuel saw the darker side of the goldfields. Fistfights broke out over disputed claims. Thieves prowled at night, slitting tents open and stealing gold dust from sleeping miners. Gambling tents took as much from a man as the river gave. Law was scarce, and what little there was came at the barrel of a gun. The McAllisters staked a claim along a bend in the river and built a crude sluice to speed their work. Weeks passed, and though they pulled enough gold to keep them hopeful, the back-breaking labor and constant risk of theft wore on them. One evening, Samuel returned to camp to find Matthew in a heated argument with Eli. Eli accused Matthew of holding back gold from the day's take, claiming he had seen him pocket a nugget. Matthew, hot-blooded and proud, denied it fiercely. The fight nearly came to blows before Samuel stepped between them, warning that distrust would kill them faster than hunger. But the damage was done. From that night on, Eli kept to himself, sleeping with his pistol close at hand. Yes! In late autumn, disaster struck. While working a narrow stretch of river, Eli was ambushed by two claim jumpers, men Samuel recognized from a saloon in Coloma. They struck him from behind with a rock, then made off with his gold pouch. Samuel and Matthew gave chase, catching them before they reached the tree line. What followed was swift and bloody. Matthew shot one in the leg, and Samuel, in the heat of the moment, fired point-blank into the other's chest. Eli survived, but the killing weighed heavily on Samuel. Out here, a man could defend himself, but the line between justice and vengeance was paper-thin. By spring of 1850, the party had pulled enough gold to make the journey worthwhile, though not the fortune they had dreamed of. Samuel decided it was time to go home. The return north was slower, weighed down by their haul and by the tensions that still lingered from the fight. In Eureka, Eli announced he would not be returning to Oregon.
Oh.
"There's more gold here," he said. "Enough for a man who's willing to take it." Samuel shook his hand, but did not try to stop him. He never saw Eli Foster again. Back in the Willamette Valley, Samuel's gold was put to practical use. He expanded the farm, bought better tools, and built a larger house for his family. But the trip had left scars. Matthew, restless and changed by the violence he'd seen, began drifting from job to job, unable to settle, and Samuel himself felt a quiet shift. The gold had been won, but at a cost that made him question whether some dreams were worth the price. Still, word of the McAllisters' return spread, and with it came a certain respect. Samuel was no longer just a pioneer farmer. He was a man who had faced the lawlessness of California and come back with his life, his gold, and his family intact. But the West was far from finished testing him. In the years ahead, as the nation crept closer to civil war, new storms would gather, storms that no amount of gold could weather. By the mid-1850s, the McAllister farm in the Willamette Valley had become one of the most respected homesteads in the region. Samuel's wheat fields rolled golden under the summer sun. The orchards were heavy with apples, and the barns were full each harvest. Thomas Jr., now a tall young man of 18, was as strong with a plow as he was accurate with a rifle. Mary's children often came to visit, filling the farmyard with laughter. And the elder Thomas, though slowed by age, still walked the fields each morning with a cane and a sharp eye. Might have been a peaceful life. If not for the rumblings from the east, letters from distant relatives in Missouri and Kentucky spoke a bitter. Arguments over the question of slavery, not just in the South, but in the new territories being carved from the West, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had opened the door. for settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. And almost overnight, Kansas had become a battlefield. Men calling themselves Free Staters clashed with border ruffians, and newspapers carried stories of raids, burnings, and murders. Though Oregon had entered the Union as a free state in 1859, the national division seeped into every conversation, every political meeting. Samuel had always believed in hard work and freedom, the kind of freedom a man earned by the sweat of his brow, not through the labor of others. He opposed slavery on principle, but he also valued the Union above all. To him, tearing the country apart would be like splitting a family in two. And even within his own bloodline, views began to diverge. Matthew, his cousin, who had drifted south after the gold fields, turned in 1856 with a Southern-born wife and a sharp tongue for abolitionist meddlers. Over supper one evening, Matthew argued that the South had a right to its way of life, that outsiders couldn't understand the peculiar institution that kept its economy alive. Samuel slammed his fist on the table, warning that no man had the right to own another. The argument ended with Matthew storming out into the night, and though he returned to apologize the next day, a quiet rift remained. The elder Thomas, now in his late 80s, said little in these debates, but when asked, he would shake his head and mutter, "I fought once to keep this land ours. If you boys ain't careful, you'll be fighting again, this time against each other." Meanwhile, the nation's politics grew more heated. The election of 1860 brought Abraham Lincoln to the presidency. With his victory came the secession of Southern states. South Carolina went first, followed by Mississippi, Florida, and others in quick succession. News traveled slowly to Oregon, but when it came, it struck like a hammer. By the spring of 1861, Confederate guns had fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War had begun. Samuel faced a terrible decision. He was too old to be drafted, but Thomas Jr., now 20, was of prime age for service. The boy was eager to prove himself, talking of joining the Union Army in the East. Abigail's face would pale every time he mentioned it, but she knew her son's spirit. "If you go," she told him, "go for what's right, not for glory." Samuel's heart swelled with pride and fear in equal measure. But before Thomas Jr. could enlist, word came that Matthew had joined the Confederate Army in Virginia. The news landed like a stone in the McAllister household. Samuel could hardly believe it. The cousin he had grown up with worked beside, and even saved from a claim jumper's bullet in California, now stood on the opposite side of a war that threatened to destroy the nation. Letters to Matthew went unanswered, and Samuel could only imagine what it would be like if their paths ever crossed again under arms. By late 1861, recruiting officers arrived even in distant Oregon, calling for volunteers to serve in Union regiments. Thomas Jr. enlisted without hesitation, leaving the farm in his father's hands. The day he left, the McAllister family stood by the front gate, watching him ride away on a bay gelding. The elder Thomas gripped his cane and stared after him until the dust settled on the road. "The boys see things no man should have to," he said quietly. Samuel returned to his chores, but the work felt different now. Every furrow he plowed, every fence he mended, carried the weight of knowing his son was marching into a storm. The skies over the Willamette might have been clear, but across the nation, clouds of smoke and powder were thickening, and the McAllisters, like so many American families, were about to learn the true cost of division. The first letters from Thomas Jr. arrived in the summer of 1862, carried west by military dispatch and passed from hand to hand until they reached the Willamette Valley. Samuel unfolded the paper at the kitchen table, the ink smudged by rain and sweat, and read aloud, while Abigail kept her hands busy with mending. Their son's handwriting was hurried but strong, his words filled with the bravado of a young man seeing the world beyond the farm for the first time. He wrote of marching with the 1st Oregon Volunteer Infantry, a regiment sent east to bolster Union forces, and of the camaraderie among men from every corner of the Union. They drilled in Washington City under the shadow of the unfinished Capitol Dome, and when they marched south into Virginia, the air was thick with dust and the smell of campfires. In those early months, the war still held a strange excitement for Thomas Jr., though he hinted at the hardships. The endless mud, the hard biscuits, the cold that crept through blankets at night. But by the time his second letter came in early 1863, The tone had changed. He described the aftermath of Antietam, fields littered with the dead, the corn trampled and stained dark. He wrote of men crying for water with no one left to bring it, of horses screaming as they lay dying. "I see Matthew's face in every gray uniform," he confessed in one line, "and I pray I never truly do." Samuel kept those letters close, reading them again in the quiet hours before dawn. He had fought once himself, against the British in New Orleans, but that had been one battle, one victory. This war seemed endless, a grinding machine that swallowed boys and returned them as broken men, if it returned them at all. By the summer of 1863, news of Gettysburg reached even the far-off Oregon settlements. It came in fragments. First the rumors of a great battle in Pennsylvania, then reports of a Union victory. Weeks later, a thin envelope arrived, addressed in Thomas Jr.'s hand, but penned in a different script. Abigail's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The letter was from a sergeant in her son's regiment, explaining that Thomas Jr. had been wounded on the third day of fighting during Pickett's charge. A Confederate shell had exploded near the stone wall where he and his comrades held the line. Shrapnel tore through his shoulder and side, knocking him to the ground. He was alive, the sergeant wrote, and recovering in a field hospital. But the wound was deep and would keep him from the front for months. Relief and fear mingled in the McAllister household. Samuel longed to be by his son's side, but knew the journey east was near impossible during wartime. Instead, they sent what they could: dried fruit, tobacco, warm socks, trusting it would reach him in the care of the regimental mail. It was during Thomas Jr.'s convalescence that the unthinkable happened. In a chance meeting of prisoner exchanges near the Rappahannock River, he saw Matthew. His cousin stood among a line of gaunt Confederate soldiers, his gray coat ragged, his eyes sunken from hunger. They locked eyes for only a moment before the guards moved them along. Later, Thomas Jr. would write home about it. "He didn't speak, neither did I, but I knew him, and he knew me. I don't know if he'll make it through this war, but I reckon we've both already lost something we can't get back." By 1864, the war's toll was heavy. The letters from Thomas Jr. grew shorter, as if each word cost him more. He wrote of the wilderness, of the choking smoke that turned day to night, of the stench of the dead left unburied. He wrote of men who no longer spoke of victory, only of survival. When the war finally ended in April 1865, news came west on a wave of relief, followed swiftly by sorrow. President Lincoln had been assassinated. The Union had been saved, but at the cost of more than 600,000 lives. Thomas Jr. returned to Oregon in the autumn, thin and pale, his right arm still stiff from the wound. Abigail wept when she saw him step down from the stagecoach, and Samuel clasped his hand in a grip that said all the words he could not. Matthew's fate came months later in a letter from a stranger in Tennessee. He had died of fever in a Confederate hospital before the war's end. Samuel stood on the porch reading that letter over and over, the ink blurring as rain began to fall. He thought of the boy Matthew had been, the laughter they had shared, the gold fields they had braved together, and how the war had made them strangers. The McAllisters tried to return to normal life, but nothing was quite the same. Thomas Jr. worked the farm, but sometimes in the fields he would stop suddenly, staring at nothing, his face pale. At night, Samuel heard him wake with a gasp, the echoes of cannon still chasing him through dreams. The war was over, but its shadow lingered over the valley and over the family, like a storm that had passed yet left the sky heavy and dark. The autumn rains came early in 1865, soaking the fields before the wheat could be fully brought in. Samuel stood in the barn doorway, watching the gray sheets sweep across the valley, the smell of wet earth rising like a memory. Thomas Jr. worked quietly beside him, mending a broken harness. Neither spoke of the war much anymore, but it sat between them like an unspoken guest at every meal. The farm, once a thriving promise, now felt smaller, not just in acreage, but in spirit. The Willamette Valley had changed while the war raged back east. New settlers poured in, chasing the promise of cheap land under the Homestead Act. Their wagons creaking down the muddy roads, sawmills buzzed by the river, merchants shouted prices in the growing towns, and newspapers carried news of the Reconstruction, a word that felt too neat for the mess it described. Samuel read of freedmen voting in the South, of Union soldiers patrolling cities, railroads planned to link east and west in steel and smoke. Yet he also read of riots, of night riders in masks, of southern towns burned not by war, but by hate that refused to die. Late 1866, a letter came from Missouri, from Samuel's younger brother Elijah, who had stayed there when Samuel went west. Elijah wrote of devastation. Fields gone to weeds, fences burned, families split apart by old loyalties. He spoke of neighbors who still refused to speak because their sons had fought on different sides. He also hinted at opportunity. Abandoned farms for sale cheap, towns hungry for trade. You could come east again, Elijah wrote. You've got the head for business and the back for farming. And God knows we need men who can see past the war. But Samuel had no wish to return to Missouri. He had left once to escape its feuds, and Oregon, for all its new bustle, still offered a sense of distance from that blood-soaked soil. Yet not all the McAllisters felt the same. Thomas Jr., restless after years of soldiering, talked of going south, not to fight, but to help rebuild. He had met freedmen in Washington City during the war and seen their hunger for schooling, for work, for a life not bound by chains. "There's work to be done there, Pa," he said one night over supper. "And if we leave it to the same men who started the war, it'll all be for nothing." Abigail looked torn, her hands tightening around her fork. "You've given enough," she said softly. But Samuel knew his son's mind was made up. In the spring of 1867, Thomas Jr. packed a small trunk, took the stage to Portland, and from there boarded a steamer bound for San Francisco, and then east by rail as far as the tracks would take him. Letters came sporadically, from Nashville, from Atlanta, from tiny towns in Georgia where he worked with the Freedmen's Bureau. He taught reading in makeshift schoolhouses, mediated disputes over land, and clashed often with former Confederates who saw him as an intruder. In one letter, he described a night when the schoolhouse was set aflame. He and two freedmen hauled buckets from the well until the fire was beaten down. But the next morning the chalkboard was found split in two, and the benches smashed. "They think they can scare us off," he wrote. "But we've lived through worse." Back in Oregon, Samuel faced challenges of his own. The price of wheat fell after the war as eastern markets flooded with surplus. Railroad men came west offering to buy land for future tracks, but their prices were low and their contracts full of words Samuel didn't trust. Neighbors argued about whether to sell or hold out, about whether progress meant steel rails or keeping the valley as it was. In 1868, disaster struck. A late frost killed much of the wheat crop, and with debts mounting from equipment repairs, Samuel had to sell off 30 acres to stay afloat. He felt the loss keenly, not just in coin, but in pride. The McAllister farm had been his dream since the Missouri days, and watching it shrink felt like losing a piece of himself. That same year, word came from Georgia that Thomas Jr. had been beaten in the street by masked men, his arm rebroken, his ribs cracked. He survived, stubborn as ever, and in his next letter he wrote simply, "They will not win." But the strain was visible even in ink. His handwriting, once strong and sure, wavered. He spoke less of teaching and more of keeping watch at night, of carrying a pistol wherever he went. By 1870, the Reconstruction era was fraying. Federal troops withdrew from some areas, and in their place, local militias loyal to old Confederate leaders reasserted control. Freedmen, who had voted one year, found themselves barred the next. Thomas Jr., weary and frustrated, wrote that he might return west. "I've done what I could," he said. "Maybe it's time to build something that can last." When he came home that summer, Samuel saw the change in him. It's not just in the limp that never quite healed, but in the eyes that had once been quick to laugh and now measured every room before stepping inside. They harvested wheat together, side by side, and while neither spoke of it aloud, both knew that the years between 1861 and 1870 had left marks deeper than any plow could cut. The valley was changing again. Talk of a transcontinental railroad reaching Oregon grew louder, and merchants in Portland dreamed of ships from China docking alongside American steamers. But Samuel wondered what price progress would exact this time, and whether the nation, so recently torn apart, was truly ready to knit itself whole. By the spring of 1870, the talk in every saloon, churchyard, and grain store from Portland to Salem was about the iron rails creeping toward the Pacific. The Union Pacific had already stitched the eastern half of the continent to the west with the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit the year before. But Oregon remained a stubborn gap on the map. Now the Oregon and California Railroad promised to bridge it, driving steel northward from the San Francisco line. Samuel McAllister, leaning on the counter at Whitcomb's General Store, listened as a railroad agent in a pressed coat laid out maps on the scarred pine wood. "Gentlemen," the agent declared, tapping a finger at the penciled route, "within 5 years. Your wheat will roll east in days, not months. Your beef, your timber, your wool no more waiting on riverboats or rotting in warehouses. This is the future." The older farmers grunted, skeptical. They had heard promises before. But the younger ones, the ones with mortgages and restless eyes, saw salvation in the gleam of steel. Samuel was caught between. He knew speed meant profit, but he also knew the price of giving up control to men who spoke in contracts longer than a man's arm. The first crews arrived in late summer: Irish laborers from San Francisco, Chinese crews from the Central Pacific, and rough American graders who could lay a mile of track in a day when the ground was kind. They camped in canvas tents along the valley's edge, the smell of wood smoke mingling with the sharp temps of hot iron. The sound of their hammers rang for miles. A steady heartbeat of progress. Thomas Jr., back on the farm but never entirely at rest, took work hauling timber for the trestles. He liked the pay, and he liked the company of men who had seen as much of the world's hard edges as he had. In the evenings, he'd return covered in sawdust, telling Abigail about the bridge rising over the Santiam River, about the Chinese crews who worked silently under the foreman's shouts about the gamblers and peddlers who trailed the camps. "Like shadows. It's like the war, Ma," he said one night. "Only this time the battle's for miles, not lives. But it still leaves men broken if they're not careful." In 1871, the first section of track reached Salem, and the effect was immediate. The price of wheat rose, merchants expanded their stores, strangers filled the streets prospectors, heading north to rumored gold strikes, families from Kansas and Iowa chasing cheap Oregon acres.
Ow.
But the boom came with its shadows. Land speculators began circling, offering cash for farms from owners too deep in debt to refuse. Samuel received 2 offers in 1 week for his 30-acre backlot, each higher than the last. He refused both, though he lay awake at night, wondering if stubbornness was a luxury he could no longer afford. That same year, trouble flared in the rail camps. The Chinese workers, paid less than their Irish counterparts and forced into the most dangerous blasting work, struck for better conditions. Samuel heard about it when Thomas Jr. came home with a split lip and bruised knuckles. "Wasn't my fight," Thomas said, "but I danned to stand by when 20 men set on 3, just because they danned to speak the same tongue." It was a dangerous position to take in a valley where suspicion of outsiders ran deep. But Samuel felt a flicker of pride and worry. By 1872, the railroad had pushed past Salem toward Portland, and the McAllister farm found itself suddenly valuable, not for its wheat, but for its location. Kai siding could be built nearby. The agent told Samuel if he was willing to lease a strip of land for the tracks. "Think of it," the agent said. "McAllister grain, shipped east in the morning, sold in Chicago by week's end." Samuel hesitated. The rent was fair, the promise tempting, but it meant the rail's end. The strangers they carried would run through the very edge of his fields. In the end he agreed, reasoning that the farm could not remain an island forever. The first train whistle blew in the valley in October of 1873, a long, mournful cry that made the horses shy and sent the dogs barking. Samuel, Abigail, and Thomas Jr. stood by the new siding as the locomotive rolled in, black smoke curling into the pale sky. Children cheered, men waved hats, and the station master made a short speech about the dawning of a new age. Samuel listened, but his eyes were on the gleaming wheels, the endless string of cars, the men who stepped down onto Oregon soil for the first time. He knew change had arrived for good. With the rails came opportunity, but also temptation. By 1874, gambling halls and saloons sprang up near the stations, drawing farmhands and rail workers alike. Abigail disliked the rowdiness, but Thomas Jr. argued it was simply the price of growth. The real danger, Samuel saw, was in the land rush. Parcels doubled in price in a year, and some of the oldest families in the valley sold out and moved farther west, toward the coast. Samuel stayed, but the pressure was constant. Then came the panic of 1873. The Great Rail Boom collapsed under the weight of overextended banks and bankrupt companies. Wheat prices plummeted again. Credit dried up, and construction on the line north of Portland halted for months. Samuel watched men who had bragged about fortunes reduced to begging for work. The siding at his field saw fewer trains, and those that came carried more desperate men than hopeful ones. Through it all, the McAllisters endured. They cut expenses, sold surplus livestock, and leaned on neighbors as neighbors leaned on them. Samuel, though older now and slower in the fields, still rose before dawn to walk the land. The rails shone in the morning frost, a reminder that progress could be both a gift and a warning. Thomas Jr. sometimes talked of moving east again, chasing work on other lines. But he stayed for now because family and soil still had their hold. By 1875, the economy began to recover, and with it, the trains returned in greater number. But the valley was no longer the quiet refuge Samuel had found in the 1850s. It was a place tied by steel to the rest of America, for better or worse. Standing by the tracks one evening, Samuel watched a train thunder past, bound for Portland and beyond. The ground trembled under his boots, and he thought of Elijah's words from years before. "We need men who can see past the war." Samuel realized now that the challenge was larger. It was about seeing past the boom and bust, past the glitter of progress, to the bones of the land itself. That, he knew, was what he meant to hold on to. By the summer of 1875, Oregon's Willamette Valley was draped in the confidence of the Gilded Age. Newspapers from Portland to San Francisco printed tales of fortunes made overnight, of vast ranches and timberlands turning common men into barons, cities sprouting brick storefronts and gas lights as if by magic. The telegraph poles marched beside the railroad now, thin wooden sentinels stringing the valley into the web of national news and speculation. Samuel McAllister read these papers in the dim light of the parlor each Sunday night, Abigail knitting by the hearth. The words promised prosperity, but Samuel had learned to look between the lines. For every man who struck gold or bought it cheap from a bankrupt neighbor there were 10 whose dreams ended in foreclosure. The siding on McAllister land had indeed brought buyers for their wheat and barley. Trains rolled out twice a week, carrying their grain to Portland, where it was loaded onto ships bound for San Francisco or even across the Pacific. The extra income was welcome, but it was a double-edged blade. With the market came merchants pressing them to buy new equipment, new fertilizers, faster plows, can double your yield. One salesman promised Samuel in 1876, showing him a glossy catalog illustration of a steam-powered thresher. Samuel nodded politely, but when the man quoted the price, he shook his head. "I'd sooner double my caution," he replied. Debt, Samuel knew, was a chain that could tighten until it crushed a man's breath. Thomas Jr., however, was drawn to the shimmer of modernity. The boy, though he was now 30, was restless again. He de-saved wages from hauling timber and grain for the railroad and talked of investing in a small mill upriver. "Steam's the future, Pa," he said, eyes bright. "We can cut lumber 10 times faster than a saw pit. The valley's growing houses, barns, schools, they'll need the wood." Samuel didn't dismiss the idea, but he warned his son to beware of partners with more charm than honesty. In 1877, trouble brewed in Portland. A labor strike by dock workers over wage cuts spilled into the streets, and for 3 tense days, the city seemed balanced on the edge of violence. News traveled fast down the telegraph line, and soon men at the rail yards in Salem murmured about walking out in solidarity. Samuel listened to Thomas Jr. debate with other farmhands about fairness and the price of labor. "We fought a war to keep men free," Thomas argued, "but what good's freedom if you can't feed your children?" It was the same fire Samuel had seen in his son's eyes when he defended the Chinese laborers years before. That same year, a letter arrived from Elijah, older now, living in the Idaho Territory, where he ran a modest cattle outfit. He wrote of drought, of raids by bands of Bannock warriors resisting the loss of their lands, of the Army's march to push them back. "The West is still wild, Sam," Elijah wrote. "Don't let the steel and telegraph fool you out here. Men still live and die by the weather and the bullet." Samuel read the letter twice, then folded it away. He felt the truth of Elijah's words even in the supposedly settled valley. A hard frost in the winter of 1877 killed half their winter wheat and sent prices soaring for seed. By 1878, the railroad boom returned in full force. A spur line was proposed to connect the coastal towns with the valley, and surveyors came tramping across McAllister land again. This time, Samuel refused them. "So land's already given enough," he told the agent. "If you want to go west, you'll go around me." Some neighbors called him a fool. There was money in selling. Right savoir, but Samuel saw how each acre surrendered was another acre lost to the family forever. Meanwhile, Abigail found herself part of a growing circle of women in Salem, advocating for temperance and education. The saloons by the rail yard had drawn not only farmhands but drifters, and more than one household suffered when wages vanished into a bottle. Abigail attended meetings in the back of the Methodist church, listening to women speak about schools for girls, about libraries, about laws to protect families from ruin. Samuel teased her gently, calling her his campaigner, but he admired her quiet resolve. In 1879, the McAllisters faced a more personal trial. A fire broke out in the barn one windy night in August. Thomas Jr. was the first to smell the smoke, and together they managed to save the horses and most of the tools, but the hayloft and much of the stored grain were lost. The fire's cause was never certain, perhaps a stray ember from the forge, perhaps a careless lantern, but the damage was clear. Neighbors arrived at dawn to help rebuild, bringing lumber, nails, and strongbacks. Samuel, his hands blistered and eyes rimmed red from smoke, felt humbled by the unspoken pact of the valley. In hardship, you did not stand alone. The barn was rebuilt by October, sturdier than before, and life resumed its rhythm. Yet Samuel felt a shift in himself. The world beyond the farm was moving faster, richer for some, harsher for others. The newspapers spoke of fortunes in silver from Nevada's Comstock lode, of stock market speculation in New York, of electric lights in cities back east. It all seemed impossibly far from the furrows of his wheat field. Yet the telegraph's wires and the railroad's steel rails tied even his small farm to that roaring world. By the dawn of 1880, Samuel understood that the Gilded Age was not all gold. It was brass and iron and coal dust, bright at a distance but cold to the touch. He had kept the farm intact through war, through panic, through fire. But he knew the next decade would bring trials no plow could turn and no harvest could store against. Standing by the siding, one crisp winter morning, he watched a freight train clatter past, its cars loaded with lumber, barrels, and crated machinery. The whistle's cry faded into the hills, leaving only the sound of the wind in the bare trees. Samuel turned toward the barn, thinking not of the wealth the world promised, but of the soil beneath his boots, the one treasure he trusted would endure. By 1880, the McAllister farm had become a symbol of endurance in the Willamette Valley. Samuel, now well into his 70s, moved more slowly across the fields, leaning on a cane that had replaced the stooped back of age. Thomas Jr., 33, had taken the reins of the farm's daily life, but Samuel's eyes still watched, noting every change in the soil, every bend in the river, every wrinkle in the sky that foretold rain. Abigail, resilient as ever, had grown grayer at the temples, but her hands were steady, and her voice carried the same gentle authority it had when Thomas Jr. was a boy. The decade that followed was one of growth and challenge alike. Oregon itself changed. Portland expanded, railways multiplied, telegraph lines crisscrossed the valley, and steamships linked distant towns. Grain shipments traveled in bulk across the continent, and markets fluctuated with the boom of Eastern industry. Samuel welcomed some of these changes, for they brought prosperity, yet he never lost his caution. The farm had survived floods, frost, fire, and war. It would survive industrial clamor too, if handled with care. Thomas Jr. continued his experiments in mechanized farming. Steam threshers replaced horse-driven models, plows cut wider swaths, and irrigation ditches extended farther than any Samuel had imagined in his youth. Some neighbors called him reckless, others visionary. The railroad siding remained a lifeline, carrying not only wheat but lumber, apples, and wool to markets far beyond Oregon's borders. Yet Thomas Jr. never forgot the lessons of scarcity and risk. Every innovation carried cost, every opportunity, danger. The valley itself was a tapestry of contrasts. Old pioneer families, like the McAllisters, clung to the land that had seen wars and gold fever, while newcomers, drawn by the railroad and the promise of cheap acres, built modern homesteads and towns in a flash. Schools multiplied, churches flourished, and newspapers chronicled the expansion. Abigail, now an elder voice in the community, helped establish the first library in their district and campaigned for girls' education. She argued that the next generation should have tools of the mind as well as the plow. Samuel watched her quietly, knowing that in her way, she had been shaping the valley as surely as he had shaped the fields. By the mid-1880s, the farm faced new threats. The climate proved unpredictable. A spring frost in 1883 killed young wheat shoots, and summer heat waves threatened orchards. Samuel found that decades of experience counted for something, yet even he could not command the weather. Pests, too, had arrived. Aphids, codling moths, and rootworms invaded like tiny invaders, demanding vigilance and care. Still, the family persevered, using careful observation, rotation, lessons passed down from generations to keep their crops alive. Society itself shifted. The Gilded Age brought wealth, but also inequality, and whispers of labor unrest began to reach the valley. Railroad workers struck in the nearby towns. Mill hands demanded better pay. Thomas Jr., recalling the labor struggles of his youth, spoke to men about fairness and caution. "We build together," he would tell them, "or we fall together." Samuel admired his son's pragmatism, but worried that the cycle of boom and bust was eternal, and that the land itself could not protect men from folly. By 1890, Samuel's health began to fail. Fields, once a place of joy, became a daily reminder of mortality. He still walked each morning, but slower. He rested more often beneath the shade of the apple trees planted decades earlier. Abigail, though older, kept the household and accounts with precision, reminding her husband that the farm was secure in Thomas Jr.'s capable hands. Letters arrived sporadically from Thomas Jr., who had begun negotiating small sales of surplus grain and timber. The world had become faster than Samuel could ever have imagined in the 1840s. Yet the farm endured, a testament to patience, foresight, and resilience. The 1890s also brought reflection. Samuel often thought of the first journey west in the 1840s, the gold fields of California, and the Civil War. He remembered Matthew, the cousin lost to conflict, and he wondered how different life might have been had the nation held together without tearing brothers apart. He saw now that the farm, the valley, and even the family were mirrors of the nation itself. Vast, beautiful, resilient, and always in danger of being tested. Technological advances continued. Telegraph lines carried news from around the world in hours, not weeks. Steam tractors began to appear, though Thomas Jr. favored gradual adoption. Schools, roads, and towns proliferated, yet Samuel observed that many newcomers lacked the endurance the land demanded. He warned Thomas Jr. that progress without care could erode both the soil and the soul. "The West will always tempt men with speed and wealth," he said, one evening as they watched the sunset paint the valley golden. "But it's the steady hand and patient heart that endure." By the closing years of the century, the McAllister farm had become emblematic of the pioneer spirit. Wheat fields stretched to the horizon, orchards bore fruit heavier than any Samuel had known, and the barns held horses, cattle, and grain sufficient to see the family through lean years. Thomas Jr., now a father himself, shared in the work guiding his children as Samuel once guided him. Abigail and Samuel, though older and slower, remained central to the household. Their wisdom and steadiness ensuring the farm remained more than just land. It was legacy. In 1900, as the United States entered a new century, Samuel stood at the edge of the property and watched a train whistle in the distance, its long plume of smoke carrying the promise of the modern age. He thought of all he had seen: the journey from Missouri to Oregon, the gold fields of California, the crucible of civil war, the rise of the railroad, and the storms of commerce and climate. And yet, standing there with Abigail by his side and Thomas Jr. overseeing the fields, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The world had changed beyond recognition, but in this valley, a seed of continuity endured. The McAllister story, he realized, was more than one family's endurance. It was the story of America itself, a nation shaped by ambition, tested by conflict, and built on the sweat and courage of those willing to claim a distant horizon and make it home. Samuel smiled, a rare moment of serenity. The century ahead was unknown, the challenges immense, but the land would remain. And so too would the family that had labored, fought, and persevered through nearly 6 decades of change. And in that thought, he found peace.